The neon glow of Manny's diner flickered against the rain-slicked streets, casting fractured light onto the cracked pavement. It was past midnight, the time when the city's heartbeat slowed to a murmur. Inside, the place wasn't empty, but it wasn't alive either. A couple of truckers hunched over their coffee, a college kid typed furiously on his laptop in the corner, and the jukebox played an old blues song no one really listened to. Officer Jake Miller stepped through the door, shaking off the cold drizzle from his shoulders. The scent of sizzling bacon and burnt coffee filled the air, a welcome contrast to the blood and asphalt that had been his reality for the past 12 hours. He had spent the night breaking up bar fights, responding to a hit-and-run, and comforting a terrified woman who had just been robbed at knife point. Now, all he wanted was a quiet meal before heading home. He took his usual seat at the counter, nodding at the exhausted waitress who barely looked up from refilling a mug. He didn't notice the way another employee, Tyler, a young man in his early 20s with tired eyes and a clenched jaw, stiffened at the sight of him. Tyler recognized Jake instantly. He wasn't just any cop, he was that cop. The one who had arrested his brother 6 months ago, dragging him out of their mother's house in handcuffs. Sure, his brother had been selling stolen goods, but Tyler still held on to the resentment, the feeling of helplessness that night had left in his gut. And now, here Jake was, sitting in his diner like he owned the place. The order was simple: steak, eggs, coffee, black. Tyler took the ticket without a word, walking toward the kitchen with slow, deliberate steps. The anger boiled inside him, but he didn't let it show. Instead, as he plated the meal, an idea crept into his mind. A petty, stupid, reckless idea. He glanced over his shoulder. The cooks were busy, the manager was buried in paperwork. No one was watching. With a quick motion, he leaned over the plate and spat, just once, onto the steak. A rush of adrenaline spiked through his veins. He felt powerful for a second, like he had just balanced the scales of justice in some small, meaningless way. He straightened up, cleared his throat, and carried the plate back out, setting it in front of Jake with a tight, professional smile. Jake didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. He just nodded, picked up his fork, and cut into his steak. The first bite was warm, tender, perfectly cooked, but something was off. Not in the taste, necessarily, but in the energy around him. Maybe it was the way Tyler lingered a second too long before walking away. Maybe it was the way the other employees avoided looking in his direction. Or maybe it was the way the busboy, a nervous-looking teenager, kept sneaking glances at him from behind the counter, as if he knew something he shouldn't. Jake chewed slowly, his instincts, the same ones that had kept him alive on the force for years, starting to whisper in the back of his mind. Something was wrong. He set his fork down. The diner was still, the quiet hum of conversation continuing as if nothing had happened. But Jake knew better. He took another sip of coffee, glanced up, and locked eyes with the busboy. The kid looked away immediately. Interesting. Jake exhaled, slow and controlled, and decided to wait. Because if there was one thing he had learned on the job, it was this: people always slip up. And the truth? The truth always comes out. The first bite should have been satisfying. It wasn't. Jake Miller chewed slowly, his tongue searching for something, anything, off about the steak. The texture was right, the seasoning was solid, but something beneath the surface felt wrong. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but years of working the streets had fine-tuned his instincts. And his instincts were now whispering, something's off. The diner hummed around him, oblivious. A trucker slurped his soup in the booth behind him, the college kid kept typing away, and the waitress shuffled between tables, balancing plates with dead-eyed precision. Just another graveyard shift. Just another night. Except for one thing. Jake didn't need to turn his head to feel the weight of the busboy's stare. The kid was standing by the soda machine, pretending to refill a cup, but his eyes kept flicking toward Jake like he was watching a ticking time bomb. Jake set his fork down. He exhaled through his nose, calm and measured, and reached for his coffee. The motion was smooth, effortless, just a tired cop unwinding after a long shift. But beneath the surface, his mind was working fast. His gaze swept the diner in the reflection of the chrome napkin dispenser. The busboy wasn't the only one acting strange. The waiter, Jake recognized him now, young guy, mid-20s, sharp eyes that burned with something more than exhaustion, was near the kitchen pass, leaning against the counter. Unlike the other employees, who moved with the sluggish rhythm of a late-night shift, this guy was different. Tense. Like he was waiting for something. Jake took another sip of coffee, letting the bitterness ground him. Then, casually, he reached for his steak knife and sliced another piece. Not to eat this time. Just to look. The overhead lights caught something. A thin, almost imperceptible sheen across the top of the steak. Jake had spent years on the force, investigating crime scenes, analyzing evidence, breaking down details most people would overlook. And right now, everything in his gut was telling him the same thing. Someone had done something to his food. He didn't flinch. Didn't react. Didn't let his face betray even a flicker of realization. Instead, he chewed his second bite even slower than the first. Then, with a quiet, deliberate movement, he placed the knife down and dabbed his mouth with his napkin. The busboy had gone pale. He knew. Jake turned his head ever so slightly, locking eyes with the kid. The moment their gazes met, the boy tensed, his Adam's apple bobbing in a nervous swallow. He looked like he wanted to say something but couldn't. Jake's years of training kicked in. He'd interrogated enough suspects to recognize the battle happening inside this kid's head. Do I speak up? Do I stay silent? What happens if I get caught in the middle? Jake didn't need to push. Silence had a way of doing the work for him. Sure enough, after a few agonizing seconds, the kid cracked. He took a shaky step closer and, with a voice so low it was barely audible over the hum of the diner, whispered, "Don't eat that." Jake didn't move. Why? The kid glanced toward the waiter, Tyler, his name tag read, before lowering his voice even further. He did something to it. Jake let the words settle. The confirmation. The truth. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, then folded his hands on the counter. I see. The kid fidgeted, clearly uneasy. Look, man, I don't want any trouble. Jake raised a hand, stopping him. His voice was calm, steady. You did the right thing. The kid exhaled in relief, but Jake wasn't finished. Without turning his head, he spoke just loud enough for the whole diner to hear. Tyler. The room went still. Conversations died. Silverware clinked against plates. Across the counter, Tyler's shoulders stiffened. For a split second, he hesitated, debating whether to pretend he hadn't heard. Then, slowly, he turned around, plastering on a smug, indifferent look. Yeah, he said, voice casual. Too casual. Jake studied him, his expression unreadable. The tension in the diner thickened, stretching into the space between them like an invisible wire about to snap. He tapped his fork against the edge of his plate, once, twice. Why don't you tell me what's wrong with my food? The room held its breath. Tyler didn't move. Didn't blink. But the smirk that had been tugging at the corner of his lips? It was gone. And Jake knew, right then and there, this night was far from over. The air in Manny's diner grew thick, the kind of silence that carried weight, pressing against the walls and sinking into the spaces between the counter stools. Officer Jake Miller sat motionless, his fingers resting lightly on the rim of his coffee cup. His steak, half-eaten, sat before him, an unspoken accusation on a plate. Across the counter, Tyler, his name tag catching the dim overhead light, stood frozen. The false bravado in his posture cracked just slightly, like a hairline fracture in glass. He wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what Jake was asking. And Jake knew exactly what had been done. But he wasn't going to explode. That wasn't his style. He'd learned long ago that silence was more powerful than shouting, that patience could unnerve a man more than a badge ever could. Tyler finally scoffed, forcing a smirk. I don't know what you're talking about. Jake took a slow sip of his coffee, never breaking eye contact. That so? The busboy, nervous, young, and clearly regretting every life choice that had led him to this moment, fidgeted behind the counter, looking between them like a man watching a lit fuse inch toward an explosive. Tyler's smirk didn't quite reach his eyes. I just serve food, man. Jake nodded thoughtfully. And I just eat it. He gestured to the plate. Tell me, you proud of this dish? Tyler's jaw tightened. The silence stretched again, pulling tighter, until finally, someone shifted in a booth, an older man clearing his throat, pretending not to eavesdrop. Jake sighed, a quiet, almost disappointed sound. He pushed the plate forward an inch, his fingertips barely touching the edge. Thing about this job, Tyler, his voice was calm, conversational, but it carried. I've learned that guilt has a way of showing up, even when you think you've got it buried. Tyler didn't respond, but his fingers curled into fists at his sides. Jake let the moment linger before shifting his attention. He turned slightly, his gaze settling on the busboy. The kid went rigid. What's your name? Jake asked, voice softer now. The boy hesitated. His throat worked like he was trying to swallow something heavy. I'm Marcus. Jake nodded, offering a small, reassuring smile. Marcus. He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. I appreciate the warning. Marcus exhaled, relief flooding his expression, but Tyler's head snapped toward him so fast it was almost audible. The hell, Marcus? Marcus flinched, guilt and fear warring in his eyes. He took a step back. I didn't, Jake cut in, his voice still level. He did the right thing. Tyler scoffed. Oh yeah? Running his mouth to a cop? Jake finally shifted, leaning forward slightly, resting his elbows on the counter. His presence alone seemed to shrink the space between them. You mad because he spoke up, or because you got caught? Tyler's nostrils flared. His hands flexed, like he wanted to grab something, maybe a plate, maybe Marcus's collar, maybe just the last shred of control he thought he had. Jake saw it. The micro-movements, the tension, the way Tyler's muscles coiled just slightly, like a man who hadn't yet decided whether to fight or flee. The diner watched, silent spectators in a play that was about to turn. Jake's voice dropped, low enough that only Tyler could hear. You think I don't know the look of a man trying to prove something? He let the words settle, watching the way they crawled under Tyler's skin. But let me ask you this, what exactly were you trying to prove tonight? Tyler's lips parted like he wanted to answer, but nothing came out. His jaw worked, frustration mounting, but something flickered behind his eyes, something deeper than anger. Regret. He knew he had made a mistake. And Jake knew it too. But the question now wasn't whether Tyler was guilty. That part was obvious. The real question was, what was Jake going to do about it? Because this wasn't just about a stake. It never was. And Jake had no intention of letting this slide. Not yet. Not until he got the full story. The room was holding its breath. Jake Miller leaned back slightly, his fingers drumming once against the counter. He could feel the weight of the entire diner pressing in, every pair of eyes pretending not to watch but hanging on to every second. Tyler was tense, standing behind the counter like a man with nowhere to run. He had started this night feeling in control, cocky, untouchable. But now, that thin layer of bravado was cracking. Jake had seen that look before. He'd seen it in suspects caught in their own lies. In criminals who thought they were too smart to get caught. In people who convinced themselves they had nothing to lose, right up until the moment they realized they did. But he wasn't here to scare the kid. He was here to teach him something. Jake calmly reached for his wallet and pulled out a 20, sliding it under his coffee cup. Then, with deliberate ease, he stood up, grabbed his plate, and turned toward the kitchen. Tyler stiffened. What are you doing? Jake didn't answer. He pushed open the swinging kitchen door with one hand, stepping into the back of the diner like he belonged there. The kitchen was small, hot, smelling of grease and onions. A tired-looking cook in a stained apron looked up from the grill, startled. Jake placed the plate down on the counter. "I need to see your security footage," he said. The cook blinked. What?" Jake turned slightly, his posture easy, controlled. "The cameras," he repeated. "You got them, right?" The cook hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, but I need the last 10 minutes. A thick, heavy silence. Then, from behind him, a voice snapped. "You can't do that." Jake turned. Tyler stood in the doorway now, his face pale, his confidence completely gone. His hands were clenched into fists, his breath a little too fast. He was unraveling. Jake tilted his head slightly. "Can't do what?" Tyler swallowed. You don't have a warrant. You can't just walk in here and demand footage." Jake considered that for a moment. Then he smiled, just a little. "You're right," he admitted. "I can't demand it." He turned back to the cook. "But I can ask. And if the owner of this place is the kind of man who respects his customers, he'd probably want to know what happens to the food before it reaches their plates." The cook shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Jake and Tyler. Tyler's jaw tightened. "This is bullshit." Jake didn't move. "Is it?" Tyler exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. His eyes darted toward the cook, then back at Jake, searching for a way out. And then he did what people always did when they had nothing left to hold on to. He got defensive. "You deserve it," he snapped suddenly, voice lower now, edged with something dark. Jake raised an eyebrow. "I deserve what?" Tyler's breath was shaky, but he doubled down. "You think you can just walk in anywhere and act like you own the damn place? Like you're untouchable?" He let out a short, bitter laugh. "You ruin people's lives and then expect respect?" Jake didn't blink. "That what you think I do?" Tyler's hands curled tighter. "I know you do." Jake studied him for a long moment. And just like that, everything clicked into place. This wasn't about the steak. It wasn't about a cop sitting in a diner, unknowingly pissing off a waiter. It was personal. Jake had seen it before, the resentment, the bitterness. A man clinging to something that had happened long before this moment. "Who was it?" Jake asked quietly. Tyler flinched. Jake took a step closer. Not threatening, not aggressive, just there. "Who did I arrest?" Tyler's throat worked. His whole body was vibrating with the effort of holding something in. Jake kept his voice even. "Your brother?" Tyler's breath hitched. "Bingo." Jake nodded to himself. "That's what this is about." Tyler's lip curled. "You don't even remember him, do you?" Jake was silent. Tyler shook his head, disgusted. 6 months ago. You dragged him out of our house like he was some animal. You threw him in a cage. You didn't care what happened to us, what happened to me." Jake exhaled. He was selling stolen goods. Tyler's eyes burned. He was desperate. They stared at each other, the kitchen around them fading into background noise. Jake had seen this kind of anger before. The kind that festered, twisted itself into something bigger than the original wound. But Tyler had made one mistake. He thought revenge, even a petty one like this, was justice. Jake leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only Tyler could hear. "You made a choice tonight." Tyler's breathing was unsteady. "You can make another one," Jake said simply. The room was silent. And for the first time, Tyler looked afraid, not of Jake, not of getting caught, but of what he had done. Jake held his gaze for a second longer, then turned to the cook. "Call your manager." Tyler swallowed hard, his whole body rigid. Because he knew this wasn't over. And whatever happened next, it was out of his hands. The weight of the moment pressed down like a vice. Tyler stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, his breathing shallow, his pulse hammering against his ribs. His entire world, the simmering resentment, the carefully constructed walls of defiance, was crumbling under the weight of one undeniable truth. He had made a mistake. And now, standing face to face with Officer Jake Miller, that mistake had nowhere to hide. The cook, still gripping the spatula like it might somehow shield him from whatever this was, cleared his throat. I can call Manny. He owns the place. Tyler stiffened. Don't. The word came out sharp, almost desperate. But Jake had already turned toward the cook, ignoring Tyler's protest. Yeah, he said, voice steady. Call him. Tyler's stomach twisted. His mind raced for an out, but there wasn't one. He had tampered with a cop's food. And now, reality was crashing down on him. The cook grabbed the landline hanging near the service window, his fingers punching in a number. The distant ringing filled the air, an eerie metronome ticking away the last few seconds of Tyler's imagined invincibility. Jake, meanwhile, hadn't moved. He was watching Tyler. Not with anger, not with gloating satisfaction, just watching. Waiting. And that was worse. Because it meant Jake wasn't just here to punish him. He was here to understand. Tyler clenched his fists. You don't get it, he muttered. Jake didn't blink. Then tell me. Tyler's jaw tightened. I told you already. You arrested my brother. Jake nodded slightly, like he wasn't surprised. And that's why you spit in my food? Tyler's face flushed hot. You don't know what you did to my family. The words came out too fast, too raw. He hated how his voice cracked at the end, how the frustration and helplessness bled into every syllable. But Jake didn't react the way Tyler expected. He didn't smirk. Didn't act like he had one. He just waited. Tyler let out a shaky breath, his fingers twitching. You think it's just about my brother? It's not. It's what came after. My mom had to pick up 2 extra shifts at the hospital. I had to drop out of school to help cover rent. And you? His eyes burned. You just moved on. Just another name on your case list. Just another bad guy put away. Jake let the words settle. Then, after a beat, he said, Did he do it? Tyler blinked. What? Jake's voice stayed level. Did your brother steal the merchandise? Tyler clenched his jaw, but the hesitation was there. The truth, lingering just behind his teeth. Yes, he finally admitted. But Jake held up a hand. That's all I needed to know. Tyler's stomach twisted again. That doesn't mean he deserved. Jake cut him off. I get it. Tyler scoffed. No, you don't. Jake exhaled, rubbing his jaw. You think I don't know what it's like to watch someone you care about struggle? To want to blame someone for the mess they're in? He shook his head. I know. But what you did tonight? He gestured toward the kitchen. That wasn't about justice. That was about revenge. And revenge is just another way of avoiding the real problem. Tyler's throat felt tight. Which is what? Jake met his gaze, steady and unwavering. Your brother made a choice. And you're still paying the price for it. Tyler felt the air leave his lungs. Because it was true. The phone rang on the other end. The cook straightened, his voice cautious. Manny? Hey, we got a situation. Tyler's hands curled into fists. Jake glanced toward the phone, then back at him. This is where you decide. Tyler swallowed hard. Decide what? If you're gonna let this mistake define you. The cook spoke into the phone, giving a hushed rundown of the situation. Tyler stood there, heart pounding. Jake didn't move. Didn't push. He had already said everything he needed to. Now, it was up to Tyler. And for the first time in a long time. He didn't know what he was supposed to do. The kitchen felt smaller, the walls pressing in as the tension thickened. The only sound was the low hum of the freezer, the faint sizzle from the grill where a forgotten burger burned. Tyler's heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out the cook's voice as he muttered into the phone. This was it. The moment where everything tipped. He could feel Jake's eyes on him, steady and unreadable. The cop wasn't gloating, wasn't angry, just waiting. Waiting to see what kind of man Tyler really was. Tyler's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wanted to lash out, to shove the blame onto someone else. To scream that it wasn't his fault, that none of this was fair. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had made a choice. And now, he had to live with it. The cook hung up the phone and turned, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. Manny's on his way. Tyler felt his stomach drop. He knew what that meant. Manny was old school. He didn't tolerate screw-ups, didn't give second chances. Tyler had seen him fire a waitress just for showing up late too many times. This was so much worse. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. Jake didn't say anything. He just stood there, arms crossed, waiting for the weight of the moment to settle. Tyler could feel it pressing down, suffocating. And then, without thinking, the words slipped out. "Are you gonna arrest me?" Jake raised an eyebrow, like he had been expecting the question. "You want me to?" Tyler blinked. "What?" Jake took a slow step closer. "You think that's what you deserve?" Tyler didn't know how to answer. He had been so sure, so full of anger and resentment when he did it. But now, all he felt was shame. He dropped his gaze. "I don't know." Jake studied him for a moment before exhaling. "Tell me why you really did it." Tyler looked up, confused. "I told you," Jake shook his head. "No. You told me about your brother. But that's not the whole story." Tyler hesitated. Jake's voice was calm but firm. "You're mad at the world. At your situation. At me, because it's easier than admitting the truth." Tyler swallowed hard. "And what's the truth?" Jake held his gaze. "That you feel powerless." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Because they were right. Tyler had spent months watching his mother struggle, working himself to exhaustion just to keep the lights on. And no matter how hard he tried, nothing ever got better. He was drowning. And no one had ever asked how he felt about it. Not until now. His throat tightened. He looked away, staring at the scuffed tile floor. "It doesn't matter." Jake sighed. "It does." He paused, then added, "And what you do next? That matters too." Tyler's chest ached. He had spent so long being angry, so long blaming Jake, blaming the system, blaming everyone, because it was easier than admitting how lost he felt. But Jake was right. This moment? This was his choice. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. A second later, the door swung open, and Manny stepped in. The owner of the diner was a short, stocky man in his 60s, his gray hair slicked back, his shirt sleeves rolled up. His eyes swept the room, landing on Jake, then shifting to Tyler. "What the hell is going on?" Silence. Tyler could feel the weight of the answer pressing against his ribs. This was it. The moment that would decide everything. He took a shaky breath. And spoke. Tyler's heart was pounding as he wiped his sweaty palms against his jeans. The air inside Manny's office was suffocating, thick with unspoken tension. The small, cluttered space smelled of old receipts, coffee, and grease from the kitchen. The walls were covered with faded posters and an old clock that ticked too loudly in the silence. Manny sat behind his desk, arms folded across his chest, his expression unreadable. The restaurant owner wasn't the kind of man to raise his voice. He didn't have to. The weight of his silence was enough to crush anyone. Tyler could barely meet his eyes. He knew this moment was coming the second Jake had set his coffee cup down, looked him dead in the eyes, and said, "We need to talk." Now, here he was, standing in front of his boss like a kid caught stealing from the cookie jar, except this wasn't some childhood mistake. This was real. This had consequences. You got anything to say for yourself? Manny finally asked. His voice was calm. Too calm. Tyler swallowed. His throat was dry. I messed up. Manny exhaled through his nose. Yeah. That much is obvious. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. But here's what I don't understand, kid. Why? Tyler's jaw tightened. There it was, the question he'd been avoiding since the second he pulled that stupid stunt. The question that had been gnawing at the edges of his conscience. Why? Why had he let his anger push him this far? Why had he decided that some childish act of defiance was worth risking his job? Tyler took a slow breath. He stopped himself, staring at the floor. I don't know. Manny's brow furrowed. Try again. Tyler's fists clenched. His mind raced, looking for a way out, a justification, something, but the truth was, he knew exactly why he had done it. Because he was angry. Because life felt unfair. Because cops like Jake Miller had always been a reminder of everything wrong in his world. Tyler finally met Manny's gaze. I was pissed. The words felt heavy coming out of his mouth. I wasn't thinking. I just wanted to get back at him. Manny studied him, his face giving nothing away. And did it work? Tyler blinked. What? Did spitting in his food make you feel better? Did it change anything? The question hit him harder than expected. Because no, it hadn't made him feel better. If anything, it had only made him feel smaller. Tyler shook his head. No, Manny sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. You know I can't let this slide. Tyler stiffened. Here it was. The final verdict. He knew what was coming. He deserved it. You're fired, Manny said. His voice was firm, but not unkind. Clear out your locker before you leave. Tyler nodded numbly. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud still sent a sharp pang through his chest. Look, kid, Manny continued, his voice softer now. You're not a bad worker. But this? He shook his head. This was stupid. And it wasn't just about you. You put this whole place at risk. Tyler swallowed back the lump in his throat. I get it. Manny nodded, leaning back in his chair. For a moment, it seemed like that was the end of it. But then he added, and one more thing. Tyler hesitated. Yeah? I talked to Jake. Tyler's stomach dropped. Manny's eyes sharpened. He's not pressing charges. Tyler exhaled, a mix of relief and confusion flooding him. Why? Manny shrugged. Guess he sees something in you. He gave Tyler a long look. I don't know what it is, but I hope he's right. Tyler felt the weight of those words settle over him. He had expected anger, punishment, maybe even humiliation. What he hadn't expected was grace. He turned toward the door, his mind still spinning. Just as he reached for the handle, Manny spoke again. Don't waste this, kid. Tyler nodded, pushing the door open. As he stepped back into the restaurant, he felt the shift, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. No job. No excuses. No more running from his own mistakes. Now, he had to figure out what came next. And for the first time in a long time, he had no idea where to start. The diner had fallen into a heavy silence. Tyler sat in the back booth, his fingers clenched together, his leg bouncing under the table. Outside, the neon open sign flickered, casting a weak red glow over the empty parking lot. The usual hum of late-night conversation was gone. No chatter from tired truckers. No clatter of plates from the kitchen. Just silence. And across from him, Jake Miller sat, sipping his coffee like they weren't standing on the edge of something irreversible. Tyler's stomach was in knots. He had made his choice. He had told Manny everything. The confession had spilled out of him like a dam breaking, raw and messy, every word cutting deeper than the last. And now, there was nothing left to do but wait. Manny hadn't said a word after Tyler finished. Just a long, hard look before disappearing into his office. That had been nearly an hour ago. Tyler exhaled, rubbing his hands down his face. I'm screwed. Jake raised an eyebrow. You think so? Tyler let out a bitter laugh. I spit in a cop's food. My boss is probably calling every restaurant in town to make sure I never get another job. Jake shrugged, setting his coffee down. Maybe. Tyler shot him a look. That's supposed to make me feel better? Jake leaned back against the booth. Nope. Just wondering what you expected to happen. Tyler clenched his jaw. I don't know. I wasn't thinking. Jake nodded, like he had already known that. That's usually how people end up in the worst situations of their lives. Tyler looked away, staring at the cracked vinyl of the booth. What happens now? Jake studied him for a long moment. That depends. Tyler frowned. On what? Jake took another slow sip of his coffee before answering. On whether or not you actually want to fix this. Tyler's hands curled into fists on the table. And if I don't? Jake's expression didn't change. Then you'll keep running in circles. Blaming everyone else. Digging yourself in deeper until there's no way out. He leaned forward slightly. But if you do? Then maybe tonight isn't the worst thing that's ever happened to you. Tyler scoffed. Right. Because getting caught was a blessing. Jake didn't react. Maybe. Tyler let out a frustrated breath. You really think one good decision makes up for all the bad ones? Jake shook his head. No. But it's a start. The words hung between them. Tyler looked down at the table, his mind spinning. He had spent months feeling powerless. Trapped. Drowning under the weight of his brother's mistakes, his family's struggles, his own anger. And when he had finally taken control, when he had done something, he had only made everything worse. Maybe Jake was right. Maybe tonight was a reckoning. Not just for what he had done, but for who he wanted to be. The sound of footsteps snapped him out of his thoughts. Manny stepped out of his office, his expression unreadable. He walked to the booth, stopping just beside Tyler. You're fired, he said. Tyler's chest tightened, but he nodded. He had expected that. But, Manny continued, his voice low, firm, I'll make some calls. See if anyone's willing to take a chance on you. Tyler's head snapped up. Wait, what? Manny's eyes were sharp. You made a mistake, kid. A bad one. But you owned up to it. That means something. He folded his arms. Doesn't mean I'm letting you off easy. You're gonna have to work twice as hard to prove you're not just another punk who takes the easy way out. Tyler swallowed hard. I will. Manny gave a small nod, then turned to Jake. You pressing charges? Tyler's breath hitched. Jake held his gaze for a moment, then shook his head. No relief flooded Tyler's body so fast he felt dizzy. Jake pushed back from the booth, standing up. But I'll be checking in on him. His eyes flicked to Tyler. Making sure he actually follows through. Tyler met his gaze. I will. Jake studied him for a beat longer, then nodded. The weight in Tyler's chest loosened just a little. Tonight wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. And this time, he wasn't going to waste it. The cold night air hit Tyler like a slap as he stepped out of the diner. It smelled like rain, like asphalt cooling after a long, punishing day under the sun. He stuffed his hands into his jacket pockets, his mind still reeling from everything that had just happened. He was fired. But somehow, he wasn't completely ruined. Manny hadn't cut him off entirely. And Jake Miller, the cop he had hated for months, had just let him walk away without pressing charges. None of it made sense. Behind him, the diner door swung shut with a dull thunk, and he heard footsteps approaching. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. You got a ride? Jake's voice was calm, steady, like they weren't standing on the remnants of a war zone. Tyler shook his head. "I'll walk." Jake didn't move. "You live on the other side of town." Tyler gave a half-hearted shrug. "Not like I've got anywhere to be in the morning." Jake sighed. "Get in." Tyler finally turned, eyeing the squad car parked near the curb. "You serious?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "You got a problem with free rides now?" Tyler hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to say no, to walk away, to put as much distance between himself and this cop as possible. But it was late, and he was exhausted, and part of him knew this conversation wasn't over. Without another word, he climbed into the passenger seat. The inside of the car smelled like leather and stale coffee, the faint scent of disinfectant lingering beneath it all. The radio crackled softly with voices, officers checking in, reporting locations. It felt strange being here, inside a cop car, but not in the back seat. Jake slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. "You gonna tell your mom what happened?" Tyler stared out the window. The streetlights blurred past, casting long, golden streaks against the wet pavement. "Not tonight." Jake nodded like he understood. "She's got enough to worry about." Tyler swallowed hard. He didn't want to talk about his mom. Didn't want to think about the look on her face when she found out he'd lost his job. "So," Jake said after a long pause, "what now?" Tyler let out a bitter laugh. "You tell me. You seem to have all the answers." Jake smirked. "I don't. But I know what happens if you keep making the same choices." Tyler clenched his jaw. "And what if there aren't any better choices?" Jake turned onto a quieter street, the neon lights of gas stations and liquor stores fading into rows of dark houses. "There are." He shot Tyler a sideways glance. "You just don't like them." Tyler scoffed. "Like what? Joining the academy? Becoming a cop?" He shook his head. "Not happening." Jake didn't laugh. Didn't even look surprised. "I'm not saying you gotta be a cop. I'm saying you gotta do something besides run yourself into the ground." Tyler frowned. "Like what?" Jake pulled the car to a stop at a red light. "There's a guy I know. Owns a garage a few blocks from here. He's looking for someone to help out, someone willing to work, learn a trade." Tyler raised an eyebrow. "A garage?" Jake nodded. "You like cars?" Tyler hesitated. He didn't know much about them, but he remembered spending summers watching his older brother tinker with an old Mustang, grease up to his elbows, swearing under his breath every time something didn't fit right. It wasn't a dream job. But it was something. He exhaled. "Why are you doing this?" Jake looked at him for a long moment before turning back to the road. "Because someone once did it for me." The light turned green. The car rolled forward, the hum of the engine filling the silence. Tyler leaned his head back against the seat, staring at the ceiling. A garage. A second chance. A different path. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end after all. The garage smelled like motor oil and hot metal, the air thick with the scent of gasoline. Tools clanked, a radio played low in the background, and the steady hum of an impact wrench echoed off the walls. Tyler stood at the entrance, hands stuffed into his hoodie pockets, heart pounding. This was it. His second chance. Jake had dropped him off that morning, offering nothing but a nod before driving away. No lecture, no last-minute wisdom, just a silent expectation that Tyler would walk through the door on his own. And now, standing here, he wasn't sure if he could. A man in his 40s, his coveralls smeared with grease, glanced up from under the hood of a car. His sharp eyes took in Tyler in one quick sweep. "You the kid Jake sent?" Tyler swallowed. "Yeah." The man wiped his hands on a rag, then nodded toward a toolbox. "Grab a wrench. You're late." Tyler blinked. I didn't know when to be here." The man raised an eyebrow. "Then be here earlier next time." Tyler hesitated for a second before moving to the toolbox. He fumbled with the drawers, searching for the right size. His fingers were already slick with grease, and he hadn't even started. The man watched him struggle. "You ever worked on cars before?" Tyler shook his head. The man sighed but didn't look surprised. "Figures." He reached over, grabbed the correct wrench, and shoved it into Tyler's hand. "Lesson 1, don't guess. Learn." Tyler nodded quickly, his ears burning. He crouched by the car, trying to mimic the man's movements, but everything felt awkward, foreign. He wasn't used to this, the weight of real work, the feeling of actually building something. For the next 2 hours, he did more watching than helping, listening as the man, his name was Ron, grumbled instructions and corrected his grip. He wasn't exactly warm, but he wasn't a drill sergeant either. Just another guy who had probably seen too many kids like Tyler come and go. By noon, Tyler's hands were covered in grime, his hoodie stained beyond saving. His arms ached from holding tools at awkward angles, and he had learned more about engines in 4 hours than he had in his entire life. But for the first time in months, maybe years, he didn't feel stuck. At lunch, Ron tossed him a water bottle and leaned against the workbench. "You planning on sticking around?" Tyler hesitated. "I don't know yet." Ron nodded like he expected that answer. "Fair enough." He took a sip of his coffee. "You don't strike me as a car guy." Tyler smirked. "You don't even know me." Ron chuckled. "True. But I've been around long enough to know when a kid's just looking for a way out of trouble." Tyler didn't respond. Because Ron wasn't wrong. Ron set his cup down. "Look, I don't care why you're here. You show up, do the work, don't screw around, I'll teach you." He glanced at Tyler. "But you disappear? That's it. No second chances." Tyler met his gaze. He thought about the diner, about Manny's disappointed expression. About Jake, who had given him a way forward instead of locking him up. And he thought about his mother, who still didn't know what had happened. He exhaled. "I'll be here." Ron studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good." He pushed off the workbench. "Break's over. Get back under that hood." Tyler wiped his hands on his jeans and grabbed the wrench. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving forward. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was something. And that was enough. The end.